Good afternoon. Yeah. My name is Dan Magaziner, and as Michael said, I'm a professor in the history department, which is somewhat surprising because as a historian, you wouldn't automatically expect that I read and teach Tsitsi's work and have done so for years. And if you indulge me for a minute before we get to the screening of this film, I just want to say a little bit about that because this is, as I just warned her, kind of a fanboy moment for me. When I was in graduate school back around the time when the action in her most recent book, This Mournable Body from 2018 ends, that's when I was, still a young person. And we were in graduate school, and the question that historians were grappling with and really wrestling with was how to understand colonialism beyond what had previously been understood in scholarship as a struggle between good and bad, between the imperialists and the nationalists. How do we understand the nuances of it? And how do we in particular understand all of the very intimate experiences that colonialism portended? And when I was in grad school and we were reading these books and we were arguing about it and not really getting there, there was this novel that people kept talking about and saying, you have to read Nervous Conditions. You have to read Nervous Conditions. Nervous Conditions comes closest to capturing what we think that our studies of imperialism and colonialism might actually be open to. And you have to read this book. And so I got my copy, which I was just trying to find in my office, and I couldn't. It's buried in a stack of books. And I read it, and I was blown away by it. And then when I finished my degree and I came out and I started to teach, I was determined that even though I was teaching history, I was going to figure out some way to teach that book in my classes. And I did, and it worked. And then it opened up this whole possibility and the reality that, in fact, novelists capture history and capture certain elements of human experience far better than historians. And so since that time, in every class where I can, I start with a novel. And then we spend the rest of the semester failing to rise up to the standards set by that novel. And the novel that I really, for me, was the inspiration for that pedagogical revelation, as it were, was Nervous Conditions. And it's remained the foundation of my thinking and my teaching about imperialism and colonialism and about identity and about gender in so many ways. And it's such a thrill to be with you today and to have been able to follow with your characters now with this completed trilogy. And I'm just delighted to be here with you and welcome you, as everyone else I'm sure has, to Yale. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tsitsi, who's going to introduce the film that will be screening. And then afterwards, we'll take questions about the film, and I have some questions because I can't pass up the opportunity to ask some questions of my own. So Tsitsi, welcome.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that lovely, warm welcome. It's always so gratifying to me, and I'm sure to other writers, to hear that their writing actually has some meaning to people beyond themselves. So that's wonderful. Yes, and thank you for coming out today on this rainy day to watch this short film. This is a short film made by a women's collective in my little NGO in Harare that I run with my husband, Olav, who's behind. That NGO is called the Institute of Creative Arts for Progress in Africa, and it's woman-centered, and the idea is to give young women in Zimbabwe and elsewhere on the continent the skills and the confidence to express themselves in narrative. So that could be literature, it could be film. And sometimes we engage with visual artists as well, but it's mainly in narrative of film and literature. So this is the last film that we made as a collective. I generally guide the process, and the people in the collective do everything from the scripting to the actual production. And so really, you could call them my mentees. So the film you're going to see today is a short film made by my mentees. And it really fits in with what Dan was saying, because without being prompted at all, one of the young women wanted to tell the story of how can I put this, of discovering that people in her family that she had thought were war heroes, liberation struggle heroes, were in fact not considered heroes in the community where they had operated. And this mirrors what is going on in the nation at the moment, where because of the crisis, many people are now comparing ZANU-PF to previous regimes, including the colonial regime, Mr. Smith's regime, and wondering whether that wasn't better. So this film was made in 2016, a little bit before that conversation began to take place in the country, but it already engages with that issue of disillusionment with some of the prosecutors of the armed struggle. So I would like you to watch the film, hope that it will say something to you, and then we can have a conversation afterwards.
Great. And I'm going to hazard a sort of general, maybe philosophical question that I feel like I wouldn't ask to many people, but I feel like it's one maybe you've thought a lot about. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about whether or not you think it's possible for families to live outside of history.
I don't think it's possible at all. I think the film shows that one's thoughts that dictate one's action are informed by history. And of course, one's perception of history can change, which means that one's thoughts and one's actions can change. And this basically was the trajectory that the film showed.
So, if that's the case, that we are all kind of inseparable from history, and in particular the family, and what I think is so striking about the film and about your own work as well is the ways in which families are subject to history. Yet there also is, and I'm very struck in the film in the last scene, and then also, of course, with the many sort of permutations of Tambu's character over the course of the 3 books. If you can talk for us a little bit about, given that inseparability, how do individuals, where for the individual? How does the individual figure into these when obviously we all enter into set pieces that are not of our choosing by dint of time and place of birth and being raised? Where does the individual fit in?
I think the individual fits in terms of choices, in terms of using one's capacity for reasoning and feeling and empathy to decide what choice one is going to make and which contingent action one is going to take in a given circumstance, exactly as we saw the young woman do. She could have refused to believe anything that had been said and gone off thinking that her father was still a hero, but she made the choice to change her thinking and therefore her actions.
But she still ultimately, and I've thought about this since I viewed it for the first time, but she ultimately, the act at the grave of, in a sense, burying her own memories of it with the book, or her own sort of myth that had accrued to her father's figure, but then also cleaning it and straightening it and giving it respect. It's a little bit more complicated than that, because those objects that are on the grave are objects that are meant to be on the grave, the plate and the shoe. These have certain meaning in the culture. So by removing them, she was actually removing some of the meaning. People leave the plates on the grave, and she was appropriating all the memory of her father on her own terms now by substituting those items with the book. And then also the straightening of the...
Yes, acknowledging this is still my father, but I have to take a different view of him from now on.
That's quite poignant. Thank you for I have a few more questions, but I think maybe it would be appropriate to turn it over to the audience and for audience response, and then.
Hi, I'm Sikashim Punya. I'm from Zimbabwe, so I'm very glad to have you here, especially because it's just so great to see films from home and then also just hearing Shana. I think what's crazy is the fact that you made this film in 2016, and I think personally for me, I feel like it has so much pressing relevance today. So I'm very curious. Like, a lot has happened since 2016, not just in 2017 with the coup, but with a new statement of President Mnangagwa, and then we're yet to have elections next year. But I think what's really, jarring about the film is just like, I feel like they really do speak to this idea of people still looking at liberation heroes or people from that time without the PF and still not changing their opinions or turning a blind eye to people either very corrupt or did horrible things. So I'm very curious to hear how you think about your film now, today, and how do you think it speaks to Zimbabwe's future? Because I feel like it's so pressing and relevant. And it's just like, it's crazy that you made it only 6 years ago. But I'd love to hear more.
Okay, well, I think it was quite prescient that the writer wrote this story. And in fact, she wrote the story in 2003. That was the first call that we made for women to share stories that we wanted to adapt into film in a workshop process, teaching them skills as we did so. And we received quite a few, I can't remember now how many entries, but we selected 4 for adaptation. So this was in 2003, 2004. And we developed the 4 stories. And out of those 4 short films, we were only able to make 2 by 2005. We only received funding for 2 of them. So this was one of the 2 that were left over. And in 2016, we got a micro grant. And so we thought we just have to use it to make one of the remaining scripts. And so the story is much older, which is very interesting because I think it shows that people have been thinking about these things for a while and not finding a means of expression. And so it took until 2016 for this film to be made. And I just wish we had more support for the arts, because I think we would have many more dialogues in a much healthier manner than the way we have them now. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I have a question regarding the actual process between receiving the writing and the actual screen adaptation. There's a lot that is left unsaid that kind of like allows us to feel a tremendous sense of unease in our body, as she's going through the village and not necessarily responding to the people to question why are they having this reaction. She sort of like plays it through, and that leaves us feeling kind of almost like breathless in a way, as we sit watching. And so I'm just wondering, in terms of the receipt of the writing and the screen adaptation, were there things that you deliberately left out in the workshop process to show rather than tell? I'm curious about that.
Well, definitely we do try to teach the writers to show rather than tell. A lot of it is also to do with budget. This is actually a film that has a lot of scope, and we had a tiny budget. And so we had to adapt the story that we received to a script version that would fit the budget. We in fact received stories in prose because at the turn of the millennium, most of the women did not have the skills for screenwriting. So we began from the beginning and workshopped the screenwriting and then the whole process of directing and so forth. So we tried to strike a balance between acknowledging that this is a very large story indeed, but we have limited means. So how can we tell it in a way that is still intelligible to people, using what is available in the craft of film?
Sometimes those limitations create a scenario for even more powerful telling.
Yes, well, we tried not to say too much either. So I just want to acknowledge my husband Olaf, who is the editor. We work together. And I think since then you've had some editing workshops with young women as well, haven't you?
Hello. I'm curious about the scope of the stories that the young women are telling. So there were 4. I'm curious about the other stories and how the young women are moving forward in their practice of storytelling. Is it through film? Is it through other means? So the scope of the stories and how are they moving forward in their practice?
Okay, the scope of the stories is really wide. In that 2002 batch, we had a story by a teacher about child sexual abuse by a headmaster, and I'm sure that that was based on things that she had experienced. And that was one of the ones that we shot in the beginning, and that did very well. It actually traveled across Africa. Then there was another one which was about HIV, but what was interesting about that HIV story, it didn't problematize the HIV, which is what development films usually do. It problematized the relationships between people that emanated from being in a situation where somebody is infected. And that's a film I really wanted to make. It's the last one. And I don't think I will make it simply because I think that we've had enough HIV films from Zimbabwe. Maybe I would make it COVID, I'll have to see. Because it was a beautiful story and it was really well adapted. And then the fourth one that we are, that's the fourth one that we are yet to make. The second one that we made was about a young woman who loses her child and takes refuge in one of these charismatic sects, Christian sects that we have in Zimbabwe. So a whole scope. We don't limit the stories that people bring. The only thing that limits what we can do is the amount of the resources that we receive for making the films. There was a second part to your question.
How are they moving forward in their storytelling? What are they continuing to learn new skills? Are they adapting it to other types of storytelling? How are they moving forward?
Okay. Well, the woman who wrote this film had to wait so long that she gave up filmmaking. She was a teacher and was doing filmmaking as a hobby, but decided that I've waited too long and gave up altogether, which was a shame. The young actress is still acting and working where she can in the industry or the sector, such as it is. A couple of the other people also had other careers. One was a writer and has been writing more prose than film scripts simply because it's so difficult to get them funded. But our success story is in fact the new director of graduates of the graphic design, what is it called? The Graduate School of Graphic Design, because she came through us. Nonsi Mtiti. Yeah. She came through us, and she was a young woman looking for her artistic voice, and she was with us for 3 or 4 years and discovered who she was artistically and never looked back. Some are still working inside Zimbabwe with other production houses. Generally, we see that the male-headed production houses are the ones that receive more funding than the female-headed production houses, and also depending on one's relationship with the ruling party. If you are politically exposed, then you are more likely to receive funding and support, and even international funding and support. And the rationale for that is, as it's been explained to me, is that we have to work with people who work with the government so that we can work with the government at all. If we support people who do not work directly or are not connected to ZANU-PF, then that might endanger our being able to function in the country at all. So it's a difficult situation. Others have gone out of the country, are working in South Africa and other parts of the world. Yeah.
I thought the film was really beautiful, given the story that it's telling. And I noticed that at the very first shot, that it's really what you were saying yesterday about centering your vision. I mean, it just seemed like this director really had it together. And then, so I thought that at the very beginning, and then at the very end, when I noticed that the young girl's clothes, the colors of her clothes matched the landscape. It was really quite a beautiful production, I thought.
Thank you very much. We do our best with the resources we have. And I try to teach the young people not to be limited, not to adopt that idea that we have so little, we can only do little. But the problem with that is that people then think, oh, well, you've done this with so little, we don't need to give you any more. So that's the catch.
I had a question. I was wondering how many people, or like how much exposure the film has gotten in Zimbabwe. Just like what discussions have been had, what have people been thinking about, what are the takeaways having seen the film, and taking away like what did they latch on when they watched it?
Okay, we premiered in 2017. Normally we would have had it at the Women's Film Festival, but money for film in Zimbabwe has been very tight over the last 6-7 years or so. So we partnered with the General Film Festival, male run, called ZIFT, the Zimbabwe International Film Festival Trust. And so it didn't get the kind of exposure that it would have had if we had been able to run the Women's Film Festival that year, the International Images Film Festival for Women. It was, in fact, the curtain raiser to the main film. It did generate some discussion, but not as much as I would have liked if I had been able to program it in a program of women's films at a women's festival. I'm not sure whether it has been out of the country. Did it travel at all?
Yes, it opened the New York African Film.
Oh, of course. Yes, it did. Yeah, it opened. Yeah, I remember now. Okay. Were you the person who was helping at the time?
I
No?
worked with the New York African Film Festival in 2017, but I've also just worked with them on and off.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's right. So it opened, and then I think there have been a couple of others as well. Yeah.
There are many concepts which are spread throughout the stories, and many things which one could touch on and probably mention. But I just want to ask, for me, when I watched the film for the first time, I thought about her loss of innocence from where she idolized her father to where she got to the point where she understood that this person was very different from what she thought, and still came to a place where she could find an in-between to think of her father, to still love him, but knowing that all that had happened. And I want to ask, if she idolized her father so much, if she thought so much of him, like why hadn't she come home for so long? I just want to ask that. That was the major lingering question for me.
Okay. The reason why she hadn't been home for so long is that her father was killed. And so there was no reason to go back. But now there was to be a big community gathering to allocate his land, and that was a reason to go back, in order to be present, to make her claim for that land. But you're quite right that she found her in between. And I think this is what Zimbabwe is struggling with as a nation now. How do we find our in-between? We understand that certain things happened that cost many people a lot, that resulted in political independence, but we have to go beyond that and understand that some of those players in that political independence have become the villains of the post-independence era.
I just want to make a comment also. I was really struck by the historic beauty of the landscape. It's really quite wonderful. You like that kind of landscape, which I happen to like. So, that's all.
Yes, Zimbabwe has some stunning landscapes and very diverse landscapes as well. And so it breaks my heart that we don't have a vibrant movie industry for people to see. Because I think if people could see, they would want to come and just experience it for themselves. Thank you for that comment.
My pleasure.
Can I maybe just have a comment about the young lady from Zimbabwe there, because the relevance that you spoke about is something that I think is very stark even up to today. We just had last week, we had an incident in Zimbabwe where a leading party politician basically claimed the ownership of the country because of them liberating it. Yeah, we liberated the country. I don't know how if he expressed, actually used the word own, but the way that he expressed it was clearly that he talked about property. So you do see how memory and history is actually used. And this was also the case around the time when the film was released. We had a power struggle where the president was still vice president together with a competitor, a female competitor, President Joyce Mujuru, who had carried the story of being a leading liberation fighter who shot down a helicopter of the Rhodesian army for 20 odd years, 30 odd years. Only at that point, Mugabe's wife actually had decided that she should be removed. So this story was suddenly declared as fake. You know, it was a myth that was carried on for, correct me if I'm wrong, for 40 years. It was used in film, it was used in a narrative that the ruling party was carrying on, and suddenly it was all fake.
It was no longer true.
Yeah.
And you know, people had been ululating and dancing for this woman for having been so brave and heroic, and then we were told actually it wasn't true at all.
And suddenly she was removed from office.
And this is why I feel that art is so important, artistic narrative is so important. It's what you were saying in the beginning, I think, coming back to that, because it has its own truth and its own integrity, which is maybe parallel to the facts, not entirely dependent on actual events, but it gives us a human truth that we can relate to.
I have a question, and so most of my focus, I'm at the Jackson School, so most of my focus has been on arts and culture policy. So I'm very curious to hear from you as a Zimbabwean artist if, I definitely know, and because I've lived there for so long, the issues of funding and just like things not getting done. But if money wasn't an issue, I would love to hear like what would you invest into first, where would you dedicate efforts to first? Because I feel like there's just so many amazing Zimbabwean artists, but for lack of funding, for lack of political support, we just keep hitting our heads against a lot of things, which is very frustrating, and I'd love to hear what your vision would be if that was not an issue.
Okay, the one project that I had that I pursued for until I had to stop bashing my head against a brick wall was to set up an arts college so that the different disciplines could interact with each other and people could form those creative partnerships across disciplines. So that was something I wanted to do. I think I even managed to write the syllabus for, I think, the film and the creative writing programs, but I didn't get any further than getting other people on board to say they would be interested. I had the National Gallery on board for visual and plastic arts. I had somebody on board for dance, and for theatre, but it didn't come to anything. So I think the training and education is one thing. And I think because we do not have that kind of institutionalized training and education, there is little theory, so that people do not have a background to test the stories and their style against. So I think that is one thing I would really like to see happening. The other thing that I would like to see happening is an arts fund. And an arts fund on the one hand and a film fund on the other, managed by people who actually know something about the sector that they are administering, because at the moment the people who do disperse the little amounts that we have are not really well versed in the arts that they're representing. And so that little money that we have does not go as far as it could. For example, one of the feature films that was made a couple of years ago had a budget of about $350,000 US, which is huge in Zimbabwe. And it was a film about Robert Mugabe as a hero. And I think it was finished around 2016, just before the coup. So we kept on hearing about the premiere of this film, which then never happened. And then the coup came, and then we were told, oh, okay, it's going to premiere soon. Apparently what was happening was it was being re-edited, so that the late Mugabe did not appear as quite such a hero as had been the initial idea behind the film. So it was a political project. It really wasn't a film project. At the moment, we have politically exposed people in very high places producing films, because, as you know, their colleagues, you might have heard this story, are packing gold bars into their hand luggage and flying out of the country with them. So, you know, they have the resources to make the films. But I would really like to have a situation where those people who are actually good at their art could be supported. And so most of them are no longer in the country. That's the problem. And the people who have remained in the country are these hangers-on who will just do anything in order to get the money from the political establishment.
I think we will have to leave it there. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Cici, for sharing this film with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you.